Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Media Snack, live from New York.
Greetings from London.
And so this week, big question. The question this week is, what does a media director do? Interesting, because that role has evolved quite a lot over recent years, and it's worth exploring. And we've spoken to many, many media directors over the years, and I'll reference some of those that you can go and listen to or watch to learn and hear from them. But stay tuned, because we're going to explore a quick evolution of the media director role and where they are now and how interesting that role is. And then we're going to look at 3 pieces of good advice from an ex-media director about how you can succeed in that role, all coming up on today's Media Snack. Welcome back to Media Snack. If you're new to the channel, it's good to have you with us. We are a live weekly show where we unpack the questions that you all have about media, agencies, marketing, and more. You can subscribe below to get alerted of any upcoming episodes each week. So the question of the week. Remember, we're streaming live as well, so please do leave comments down below. So David, let's unpack that question.
Okay, so what is the role of a media director? What do they do, and perhaps what should they be doing? Now, before you start unpacking that, I love this question. I spent 10 years being a global media director in Nike and Coca-Cola. So I've kind of sat in the shoes of the media director at the moment. Now, my role, a number of years ago, was very different to the role that the media director has to play now. But I can completely empathize with that position. And I spend most of my time now actually speaking to media directors about the challenges that they have. So I'm really looking forward to this episode, because we have some clear insights on how that role has evolved, the challenges and the opportunities of such an important position within a marketing organization.
Yeah, good. And that's going to be useful as we kind of share that advice. Should point out, though, even though that may be a few years ago, that at the time Nike and Coca-Cola were considered pretty progressive in media. So a lot of the behaviors that you share with us about what it was like in those companies controlling media, are not outdated. These are still very progressive companies. And so let's quickly kind of just step back for a second. So I think we all agree the role of the media director has evolved a lot. And if you're a media director, or you work with media directors, either as a marketer or an agency or somebody else, you'll know that role is very different than it was a few years ago. The old traditional media director's role was very isolated, actually. You would tend to be, we jokingly kind of say, the media director was at the end of the corridor in the marketing department. Like, nobody typically went down there to speak to them. And that person was really not a media director, wasn't particularly strategic. They would often, could be regarded as a vendor manager. It was their job to kind of steward the money into the agency and manage the agency effectively. And that's when the agencies really control everything. Now we have media directors that are applying a lot more control in the media operations and in the process. Actually, media far more integrated in the wider media organization, as we talked about before. There's so many reference points in this episode that we'll link to down below of like really good conversations. I'm immediately thinking, a great conversation with Ron Amram at Mars, where he talked about exactly that dynamic, and at Mars, media now being much more central to the marketing org. But we'll ping all these links down below, and you can kind of pick those up. That was a problem for the media director, because you're at the end of the corridor and there was nowhere to go. Media directors did not become marketers. There was a ceiling to where you could go as a media director, and it had kind of limited career prospects. You tended to find people in that job for a hell of a long time, and yet they were responsible for a huge amount of money, of the company's money, but not necessarily put under the right scrutiny, and not given the authority to really do stuff with that money. It was about spending it effectively, I suppose. Those that were around in full service agencies will remember that media was always the last 5 minutes of the presentation. You can listen to a podcast interview I did with Jerry D'Angelo, who's global media director of P&G, where we talk about that. The media being the last minute of the presentation, and how unimportant it used to be, and now how significantly that's obviously all changed. It's the biggest budget. It's the biggest part of marketing budget. It's often one of the biggest spends that an entire enterprise or corporation will make each year is actually on the media. And it needs to be far more integrated into the marketing org. The media director now, and we explored this in an episode recently that we called Pancakes or Tent Poles, which is basically the idea that a media director is being spread very thin across adjacent functions. Good thing, but also that's difficult. It's difficult to be seen as the evangelist and the expert in many, many different disciplines, because media's pushing into, e-commerce, CRM, retail, affiliate marketing, all these kind of different areas where the media director is expected to be able to bridge into adjacent functions.
Yeah.
And it requires a specific type of person. Bill Duggan at the ANA has been a real proponent of this, but there's good sentiment behind it, which is this idea of having a chief media officer. That it's actually, media is that important as a significant investment in company growth, that it needs very significant expertise and leadership these days, more so than ever, and better governance. We as a company talk about, and we advocate this narrative to CMOs and media directors about media being an investment in growth and not a cost to the business. And that's a really important, critical narrative that a media director should be driving through the business.
Yeah.
Because if your business sees media as a cost to be managed downwards, or to be money to be spent, which is a big complex issue, which we shall unpack further, it's very hard to be a media director because you're spending money and your job is to try and make it as cheap as possible. Very different if your company views media as an investment in growth, and therefore you get to be in charge of it as an investment and make decisions about where those dollars drive business outcomes. And those media directors that can evolve their organization to thinking like that love being media directors, because you are far more influential in the marketing organization, and you typically get, and we'll come on to some examples I know that you've got, you'll get resources from the company to be able to build the systems and capabilities and structures required internally to manage large investments. Very easy to spend $100 million through an agency if you want to. One person could do that. That's not a big job, but just to spend it. But if you actually want to think about it as an investment and really organize yourself to make sure every dollar is driving an outcome, that's a very different thing. So good media directors inspire their organization of what to do, and importantly can take a strategic view of what not to do. They can lead their organization. And there's many other things that we could go into. Great media directors are a huge asset to their company because they probably understand their customer better. They understand not the existing customers, but future customers, because the media thinking is about connecting with future customers. And they tend to segment the marketplace based on media audiences, which are important because, of course, you can tailor messages to specific audiences. So they can be really good advocates, actually, about sources of growth and opportunities of growth for the business wider than just obviously investing in media. And that's the whole principle. ID Comms we call media for growth, and that's the kind of the systems that we build for advertisers. So it's evolved hugely. That's the story. Media director is an incredible job. It's still somewhat lonely and isolated. But it's more under scrutiny than ever, as the corporate agenda sees media as an investment in growth. As a media director, you're more accountable to that. Yeah. But that actually has elevated the role for those that want it to be a really critical part of marketing success. And so we need more great media directors, I suppose, is my summary of that. So for those in that role, you've been in that role. For those that are in that role, what are the tips for success? Because it's a daunting prospect stepping into that.
Yeah, I think so. But you said it right. We need more good media directors, but there are lots more opportunities out there. And I suppose the big difference, the first point that I would say is that the big difference perhaps from when I was a media director, and even when media directors were around 4 or 5 years ago, is they were responsible for a particular function. Media directors increasingly now are critical leaders within a media organization. There are huge teams of media operators within marketing functions that report into the global media director or the regional media director. And so that sense of leadership is critical. And with that comes responsibility. You have to set a vision, have an ambition for media, clearly define the role that media plays within your marketing function and as a lever of business growth.
Yeah.
Understand very clearly what the internal roles and responsibilities are. It's very easy to build layers of personnel and have duplication. Be really clear what the roles and responsibilities are. But critically, you have to take accountability and responsibility to champion the media function internally. Yeah. Make sure you get on that top table, and you as clearly as you possibly can, you articulate and link the business outcome based on the media input. And if you can own that as a narrative internally, then you'll get even more traction. That's the first thing.
Yeah.
When I was a media director, to a degree, my job was to kind of manage my agency. I empowered them to sort of do most of the decision making. That's no longer the case, right? Even very good agency client partnerships have a media director who is controlling the decision making. Okay. And with that, you have to make certain decisions around basics. Make sure that you've got control over your contracts. Make sure that you've got access and understanding of your data sets, right? Understanding where the capability gaps sit within your function and how perhaps they're being compensated for by your agency partners. But critically, and every media director that I've spoken to in the last 2 or 3 years has this on their agenda. Understand what your in-housing or in-sourcing strategy and roadmap is going to be, because you're going to get asked it. You're going to be asked to deliver that to your CEO or CMO at some stage. So have a point of view on that. Doesn't mean you need to bring the entire function of media internally, but at least having a strategy and a roadmap is going to be absolutely critical.
Just on that, we heard, I referenced it earlier, but the smart media directors on that point say, tell me what not to do.
Yeah.
Help us understand what not to do. It's just as important as having a road. It's important to have a roadmap, but what are we not going to do? Because there's so many things that a media director could be doing. They get pulled all over the place, and you've got to really fix your, points of agreement with your internal org.
Absolutely. And the final point that I would say, and you referenced it earlier on, Tom, is that it can be quite a lonely place. You might have a team around you, but you're the key decision maker when it comes to kind of media. You've got responsibilities and accountabilities up and down, and you can feel somewhat isolated within that position. You assume that all your competitors and everybody else in the marketplace are doing things perhaps better than you are. They're progressing quicker along that journey. And actually, the truth of the matter is that they're probably not. And my recommendation there would be to kind of actually reach out to your peer group. There are brilliant forums. The WFA, ISBA, the ANA all have media leader forums that allow you to share best practice and begin to kind of express challenges to see whether anybody else has figured it out first. I mean, we do that when we work with media leaders, and we help them define and redefine their operating models. We bring in other peer brands to help articulate the journeys that they've been on in order to perhaps fast track some of the strategies that we want to sort of bring in there. And that's hugely valuable, quite cathartic in many aspects. But don't remain in your ivory tower, blinkered with your to-do list. Think beyond that and reach out to industry leaders that have similar profiles and similar jobs as you do, either through a trade body function or perhaps even through us, and use that as a network of value exchange. I think that's really important.
Yeah, really good. Really good. I mean, we probably won't have time to get into it into this episode, but the WFA, which you referenced, published pretty recently a report that they'd done into what they called the capability gaps, and they interviewed about 50 media directors or media leaders within a lot of their membership. And as as many of you probably know, that these represent typically kind of the major advertisers around the world, and that highlighted some of these areas that we've been talking about. And identified where some of those gaps are. I think that deserves its own episode at some point. If someone's kind enough to offer up a question around that, we'd be delighted to answer it. But just to bring this together, what does a media director do? I think, as you've explained, there's a strategic narrative, which I know sounds kind of fluffy when we say these things, strategic narrative. I mean, but strategic narrative, and that's, as you described it very well, it's like really owning and positioning media as an investment in growth and the resources required. Okay, you've got to be able to take the higher view and make a big call on how money's going to be applied and where, and particularly things you're not going to do. There's so many kind of risky bets you can place in media, and you've got to decide, how much risk to take or not to take. You've got to set that tone for the organization. That's really important. You've got to build the structures. So you're responsible for quite a complex infrastructure and supply chain. Yeah. When I say quite complex, it's probably the most complex supply chain that there could be, probably within most corporations. The media supply chain, incredibly complicated, and you've got to be able to navigate and explain away all of that stuff.
That's the challenge. The simplify. You've got to be able to have that communication, that dialogue with experts. So you've got to be able to speak within their language, but you've got to take that and you've got to simplify it to the key stakeholders in your organization that don't have the media vocabulary that we've all created that is super complex and confusing.
Yeah. And so that's like another big ask, so to be that kind of translation and simplify the industry. And I think the final one is, we find that a lot this can be kind of point of stress for a lot of media directors, is that you feel kind of on edge and you have to be on your toes, because as media directors become more visible and more senior within organizations, as chief media officer, as an example, you're going to get a call from the CEO or the CFO or somebody internally saying, what's all this I'm reading about brand safety? Like, what about this issue? Why are brands pulling out of this particular platform or others? Like, what's our point of view? You've got to have a point of view on everything. And that can be incredibly kind of scary, taking on that responsibility. That's where you need good partners around you, we play a role sometimes to support media directors in that, to kind of give them the intelligence that they need. Not that they're not intelligent, but the intel that they need in some of these key places. The agencies, your agency, if you've got a really good relationship with your agency, they're going to be critical in being able to navigate some of these quick decisions that you're going to have to take, because media is always going to throw up these curveballs as well. It's not a safe, steady, solid place to be. It is like an extreme sport, so you've got to have a bit of an willingness to take on some adrenaline at some point as well. I think, to be successful.
Yeah.
Good. Any closing thoughts on that? You recommend it as a role, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I mean, how magical would that be? I mean, I thought I was one of the most privileged kind of stakeholders in the marketing function when I was having this kind of role. But to be able to have even greater control and influence over such a significant business spend, and link that to a business outcome, and act as that enabler of growth is hugely empowering and privileged. And just one small anecdote, if I can, because I love this story. And this, if anything, I think this reflects the positive growth and positive progression to media being seen internally as a growth driver for business growth. A client of ours that we won't name, but we've worked with for a number of years, 2 years ago went to the board of directors to go and put forward a case for increased media investment. And the case that he was putting forward was based around some very clever econometric modeling that illustrated quantifiably that that company's media investment had driven footfall and traffic and growth of that kind of business. And so this person was going to the board asking for an increase of 10% on their annual media investment. Yeah. Not only, he was obviously a very compelling media director, but not only did the board sanction 20% additional year-on-year media investment, but they also gave him enough resource to build an additional 60 internal media operators, right? To recruit an internal 60 media operators on the assumption that with this extra media investment, they needed to have the internal capabilities in order to make even smarter media investments. And I just love that. So it's not just about spending more money. It's about spending the right money in the right places, both externally as working capital, but also internally with the right skill sets to make even smarter media decisions. Now, that's a company that is going to drive competitive advantage without question.
Good. And that's an investment in growth. We love that. Please share your experiences being a media director, good and bad, or working with media directors, or any other observations that you've got. Feel free to leave comments down below and send us any questions that you'd like us to cover on a future show. If you like this episode, please give us a thumbs up down below. It helps Google algorithm, and where else this is shared, make sure it reaches people like you that might be interested in it and helps them find our channel. So appreciate your support. But that's it for this week. See you next time.
Bye for now.
Media Snack is brought to you each week by ID Comms, the award-winning growth consultancy specializing in media. We help advertisers on a life cycle to growth in 3 service areas: operations, partnerships, and optimization that transform your media investments into real company growth. Whether you're planning an agency pitch, upgrading your media organization, want to learn new best practice, or simply get better performance from your media investments, you can find out more at idcomms.com/growth.